Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of A Look Beyond the Book. I'm super excited today to interview someone who I've actually met once. I'm very excited. This is my second time interacting with him. He is the author of a fabulous book called Into the Magic Shop, which you can tell I didn't like at all. It's not highlighted or flagged or, all of these things. He's also the director and founder of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford. And he's also, a neurosurgeon, just a few of the things that he does. So welcome to the show, Dr. Jim.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a joy to be with you. And it is our second meeting. So hello. So what can I do for you? You want to hear something about me?
Yeah, well, I would love to know just something. Actually, let me just start off because I do want to talk about the book, but I want to ask you some questions about the compassion research that you do.
Sure.
So I am a huge fan of some other agencies like yours, like CCARE, but also there's the Greater Good Science Center out of UC Berkeley. There's the Institute for Healthy Minds out of University of Wisconsin with Richie Davidson. There's UC San Diego has a Center for Mindfulness. Notre Dame has a compassion, branch. My question is, why and how do you think compassion and academia and scientific research, why are they all coming together right now?
Well, I think there are several reasons. There's been a lot of interest in mindfulness and meditation that has been ever growing, actually for the last 30 years. And this was initiated by the work of Richie Davidson at University of Wisconsin, the Center for Healthy Minds. And 10 years ago, based on my own interest and my own feeling that compassion was an integral part of one having a meaningful life, living a positive life, and had a huge effect on one's physiology is when I began exploring this, and the center was created with the Dalai Lama being the founding benefactor. At that time, in my conversations with academics, if you use the word compassion, basically it was understood to be a dead end if you wanted to have any type of academic career because it was not an area worthy of study, which is sort of interesting. And in some ways, this mirrors what occurred in the 1920s when a concept was presented to actually do exercise. And in fact, at the School of Medicine at Harvard, this idea of studying physiology of exercise was poo-pooed as well. And in fact, the individual who founded ultimately a center at Harvard actually ended up doing it in the business school. So the concept felt, I think, for a lot of people, academics, to be somewhat soft. What does it really mean? But over the last decade, as you have probably seen, and many have seen, this whole field of compassion research has exploded. And in fact, I edited something called the Handbook of Compassion Science, or the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, which Oxford University Press, one of the most prestigious presses in the world, has recently published in October of last year, which really brings together all the research, the latest research, cutting-edge research in this field from a variety of domains. And fundamentally, it is demonstrated without question that compassion, number one, is worthy of study. Two, understanding how being compassionate affects our physiology is profound. And by, if you will, practicing compassion with intention has a profound effect on one's mental and physical health, and obviously also on those around them. And this interfaces with the work of Richie Davidson, who has now shifted his own work towards compassion. Certainly a lot of what the Greater Good Center does is also focused in this area. And so it's sort of an exciting time to see this area explode when it had earlier been felt just to be not an area worth study.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you work with a lot of patients. You mentioned healthcare. How does compassion impact our health, both giving it and receiving it?
Well, first of all, in addition to this concept of compassion, there's been actually a lot of scientific work done in an area called self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know in the West is that a lot of people, based on our culture, have a negative conversation going on in their head. They beat themselves up. And in fact, many people would not treat their worst enemy as bad as they treat themselves.
Absolutely.
It's a lot of negative self-talk. And we know that when you have a lot of negative self-talk, oftentimes you feel you're not worthy of love, you're not worthy of being someone being compassionate to you or nurturing you or caring for you. And when you feel that way, what that does is it triggers this part of your autonomic nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, which is your flight or fight response. And while on the savannah in Africa, at an earlier part of our evolution, it was very helpful. In modern society, it can be very detrimental to one's health, because when you have the chronic release of the hormones and proteins associated with that type of response, it has a huge, huge negative effect on your physiology. It affects cardiac function, it affects peripheral vascular function, it affects the immune system, and actually it results in the production of inflammatory proteins, which are associated with a lot of chronic diseases. So we know that when you beat yourself up, it's not a good thing. And obviously you probably know that, and most people do. But it's very hard not to. And so we actually have developed techniques that, as others have, that allow you to be much more kind to yourself. Because the other problem is, when you beat yourself up, two things happen. One is a form of self-absorption, and not a good one, of course. And the other is that when you don't think you're worthy of compassion, it's hard for you to look out and see the world and see that other people are. So it's really negative to you, and it's negative to all of those around you.
Absolutely. I like to call those automatic negative thoughts, or ants, and I keep a little ant on my desk to remind me if one comes in, I just need to shoo it away like I would any other ant.
Automatic negative responses. I'm trying to memorize all these. You have PERMA, you have BBC.
I know, and you know.
So I'm learning something here.
Oh, good. So let me follow up on something you just said, because I teach a lot of teachers and administrators, and one thing I talk about is how their presence impacts the world around them, that their presence creates the climate in the room that they're in. And really what you just said about self-compassion, if we don't have compassion for ourselves, it's much more difficult to have compassion for others, and vice versa. Sometimes we do have compassion for others. It's hard to have presence with ourselves. Why do you think that it is so important that we cultivate our own? I think sometimes in the giving industry, the medical field, the education field, we're so focused on giving to others that it's hard for individuals in those fields to take care of themselves.
I think that's absolutely true. And if you look at the personality structures of people going into these fields, oftentimes, frankly, they're damaged people, right? And because they're damaged, and oftentimes they don't look at their own pain, they think that by giving everything to others, it'll somehow help them. And it doesn't, and oftentimes it makes their own pain worse. It's sort of a Band-Aid on your own problem. Plus, the other thing that happens, even anyone, if you feel overwhelmed with the requirements placed upon you, this turns into a form of chronic stress. And there's something called eudaimonic stress, which is the natural stress of living, which is limited. It's not overwhelming. You can deal with it. And actually, that type of stress is very helpful for you building sort of a strong self. But when you feel that you can't handle it and it's overwhelming and you have your own issues of suffering, your own pain, then you can drown in it. And what happens then is you can't focus, you can't do your job, you feel that you're even more worthless. And it's an epidemic. It's an epidemic in medicine, it's an epidemic in the teaching profession. And any of these people-to-people professions, because so many people, because they're hurting themselves and know what pain is, they want to help others, but you can't help others if you can't help yourself, right?
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about how you, because I know you do work for teachers through the Center for Compassion. What are some of the programs that you have, or can you tell us just a little bit about the Center for Compassion?
Sure. Well, so the center that examines the neuroscience of compassion and altruism. And it's fairly broad. One of the things we do is fundamental research. Another is we have lecture series where we bring scientific experts. Another is we put on conferences, as an example, compassion in healthcare, compassion in business, compassion in education. And also we have developed interventions or training programs based on science that demonstrate that you can actually be more self-compassionate, you can be more compassionate to others, and by the nature of this practice or technique, improve your life and the lives of those around you. And it's called a Compassion Cultivation Training Program, and we teach it worldwide now. And it's been validated in a number of studies. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And it is used in educational and healthcare environments. And then the other thing that we do as a center is something that I particularly enjoy and is quite selfish, which is I do a thing called Conversations on Compassion. And it's like, I would say Charlie Rose, but I guess now he's a bad guy. But what happens is I just bring somebody I think is interesting on stage and we talk for an hour. And it's included the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, Amma, the hugging guru, Werner Erhard of Est fame, and a whole variety of other folks, as well as scientists, business leaders, actors, actresses. And all of those actually are online, readily available to look at, hundreds of hours. I certainly don't look at them because I don't really want to see myself, but they are there. And many people really have profoundly been affected just by those conversations to see how important compassion has been in people's lives who some of us look to as icons or highly respected people. And these are people who've really, frankly, changed millions of people's lives in a positive way.
I will put some links in the comments so people can go look at those. I know that you're obviously done a lot of work with the Dalai Lama. You mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh. I know that you've done an interview with one of my other heroes, John Kabat-Zinn.
Sure.
What have you learned not from what you've read by them or seeing them speak, but just by being in their presence? What is like a couple takeaways you've had from those people?
Well, when you interact with, and I'll use the term evolved person, and I think a person who has self-awareness, who's done a lot of internal work, oftentimes meditative practice, who has what I would call both clarity of vision and clarity of intention, there are a couple things that have struck me. Because it's interesting, if you read my book, you'll know that I'm an atheist. And people say to me, geez, Jim, you hang out with all these spiritual and religious leaders, how come it seems so easy for you to have a relationship with them when you believe in nothing? And I've had even people who are their followers say, geez, I followed so-and-so for 20 years. I've read everything. I've done everything, yet I've never met them, and nor do I feel I can get close to them. And what I tell people is that an evolved spiritual leader can, in a microsecond, determine if somebody is not authentic, if someone has an open heart, and if someone cares. It's really not about the dogma. Okay. And in fact, I've never had any of these people I've interacted with ask me a single word about what I believe, or if I'm their follower, or if I've read all of their stuff, or the stuff with their religion. Never. In fact, I usually just BS them and crack jokes. So what can I tell you? But what they do know is that I have an intention of my own purpose to improve people's lives and to work in this area, which the science of this and what we found completely aligns with everything we know, of which the majority of the world's religious and spiritual traditions are based, which is compassion. So in some ways, I sort of bring a attitude of the importance of connecting what people sort of strive through from spiritual practice, and add the imprimatur of science to it, and they align quite well. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in modern Western society, we do not, when we interact, people interact usually in an authentic way. And what I mean by that is that when you meet someone new, you don't sit there and tell them all about your shadow side or all the negative. Right?
You don't? Oh.
I know them about you, but we don't do that. Right. What we try to project to people is a picture of our best selves. And, we say, I did this, I accomplished this, I'm so great, et cetera, because we're afraid of being judged. Mm-hmm. And, of course, then when you put that mask on, the other person is compelled to do the same thing. And it prevents you from having true, authentic connection. And without true, authentic connection, it's hard to be present, it's hard to care, it's hard to love, it's hard to embrace someone. And what happens is that when you feel that you are not being judged, then suddenly that psychic energy that's put toward holding that mask in front of you is gone. And suddenly you have a lightness of spirit, a sense of happiness, because in the presence of a Dalai Lama or Om or some of these individuals, you don't have to have any pretense. You are universally loved, and there's no judgment. And what a wonderful place to be in the presence of someone who just loves you for you. And that includes the great parts of you and the things that aren't so great. And all of us have those. And what a lot of people spend time doing is trying to hide their shadow or the negative part of them. And all that does is create more stress and angst. And when you recognize it's not going to work, when you recognize that that shadow side or those bad parts of you are part of you, and you're able to sit with that reality without beating yourself up, but acknowledging it and doing what you can as a human being to deal with that, but knowing it's not going to go away necessarily, then you are much more likely to be present and to be authentic. And in some ways, it's being compassionate to yourself. It's some way loving yourself and accepting yourself. When you're able to sit there and say, I am a good person, I deserve to be loved, I deserve to be cared about, I have something to offer, and you don't have to put this projection beyond that. It's a wonderful bliss. In fact, having hung out with many of these people, every time I am in their presence, I just have this wonderful lightness and happiness and try to have a big smile on my face. And then once you get back into real society, normal society, which is often not as nice, or you're being judged. So it's going, oh God, I'm back here again. But if you remember this thing where you came from and care for yourself, then you can go in the world this way and not be so susceptible to judgments by other people.
Absolutely. I have recently been doing some work with educational leaders where we've talked about the importance of vulnerability and how vulnerability breeds trust. If I share some little secret about me or some side of me, and then you share, then we have more connection and empathy. And doing exercises like the Just Like Me meditation and to build empathy in our shared humanity, I think it's huge.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And but those types of Just Like Me exercises, and one of the challenges for a lot of people is, as we were talking about earlier, many of us are judgmental of other people. And when you are able to start looking at, it's easy to love those around you who care for you, your family, your children, etc., at least most of the time. But, as you start heading towards people further away from that, such as maybe coworkers you may be neutral about, or then you start heading towards people who are not so nice, or people who are even your enemies. The reality, though, is that most people, in terms of their life goals, are usually very similar to your own. And if you were able to sit in the person's shoes, the other person's, you often understand their perspective of the world and understand their fears and anxieties, which cause them to behave in a negative way, right? So when you're able to look at others in that way and understand that we're all suffering, you're much more likely to judge. And people have the ability to intuit people's emotional states or their feelings from facial expressions, from body language, even smells. And I say, and you referred to my book, Into the Magic Shop, which is a memoir about my own difficult childhood and incorporates neuroscience and what we call contemplative practice or meditation. But what I talk about in my book is that when I was no longer judgmental of everyone and was able to be much more kind to myself, that changed how the world interacted with me. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that I was now, continuing to fight the world and everything around me because of my own anger, my own shame, my own suffering. I was much calmer and open because I understood that everyone is suffering. And people were no longer judgmental of me and, in fact, embraced me. And that fundamentally is what allowed me to be successful in the context of most of our present society standards, but also to be successful in the context, hopefully, of being a good person.
Absolutely, that emotional contagion. Let's talk about the book for a second. So I'm in a 1-minute nutshell of the book. It starts off, it's really the story of your life. As a 12-year-old, starts off as you, a 12-year-old kid, going to a magic shop looking for a magic thumb and discovering a whole different kind of magic through a woman there named Bruce, right, who teaches you things about, and not with this language necessarily, but about mindset, about neuroscience, really, and about mindfulness and about having an open heart and compassion, and how that experience, both at that age 12, and then years later as an adult, impacted you. Can you add a little bit, just share with the audience, because for those who haven't read the book, and I'll be putting the link into that too, about how that young boy, that 12-year-old boy, then became a neurosurgeon, and then became someone who became really his one main purpose of his life is to spread compassion across the globe. How did that happen?
Well, that'll take a couple minutes, but as I alluded to, when I was at the age of 12, I was living in difficult circumstance. My father was frequently unemployed. He was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke. She was paralyzed partially, had a seizure disorder, was chronically depressed, attempted suicide. Neither had gone to college. We were on public assistance my entire life growing up. This is not the environment, as an educator, for a child to prosper in. In fact, we know from the work that's done with adverse childhood experiences that when you have poverty, when you have mental illness, when you have drug or alcohol abuse, the likelihood of you overcoming those and reaching your potential is extraordinarily low. And if you're a minority, even lower. But what we also know is that at the right time, if someone cares, it can change everything. So I was particularly vulnerable. I had a lot of anger, shame, disappointment, fear. And this woman, when I walked into the magic shop, was the owner's mother. He wasn't there. She was just there sitting in while he was running an errand. And she knew nothing about magic, at least what they sold in the shop. But what she did know is human beings and people and human nature. And she, first of all, by her immediate interaction, which was with a radiant smile, an embracing smile, I did not feel I was being judged by how I appeared or how I acted or this negative energy I was probably giving off. And so she was non-judgmental, and she treated me as an equal.
Beautiful.
She didn't look down on me. She sincerely asked questions. And once I didn't have really fear or anxiety, I answered them. And this led to a authentic interaction, human connection based on trust. Okay. And so at the end of about 20 or 30 minutes, she said, I'm here for the summer, another 6 weeks, and I think I could teach you something that could really help you and maybe even change your life. And to be honest, as a 12-year-old, I didn't know what the hell that meant. But she was giving me cookies. She was nice. And frankly, I had nothing else to do. So I showed up every day. And over that period of time, she taught me some profound lessons that changed everything. And this was in 1968, before we used the terms mindfulness or neuroplasticity. And so the first thing she taught me was that you can't learn, you can't achieve if you're not present. If you're stressed, if you're anxious, it's hard to be present because either you are having regrets about the past or fears about the future. Mm-hmm. So she spent a great deal of time teaching me actually just how to relax my body and to breathe. And we know that once you're able to relax and doing certain types of slow inward breathing and exhaling, that oftentimes this will result in shifting from this fear mode or the engagement of your sympathetic nervous system, your flight or fright response, to shifting towards your rest and digest response. And this is the response which we're actually made to be in which our physiology functions at its best. You are relaxed, you're calm, you're not fearful. And when that happens, several other things happen. This part of our brain, which we call our executive control area, works at its best. You're able to have access to memories, experiences, and make thoughtful, discerning decisions. Additionally, because of that reality, you're much more creative and you're much more productive. When you are scared, you are in survival mode. Your frontal executive control area is shut down. You don't have access to that information and you're just trying to survive. So it limits your possibilities. Plus, when you're stressed and anxious, clearly you're not creative, and clearly you're not as productive. So when you're able to go into that mode, not only does it give you these wonderful aspects, but it also allows you to connect. Because if you're fearful or anxious, you can't connect with another person. So when you're able to authentically connect, then all sorts of other possibilities are likely. So that was the first lesson, and I call that relaxing the body. And it's now a very common practice, both with mindfulness meditation and other types of meditative techniques. The second thing was that what I did not realize, and we alluded to it earlier, is that we beat ourselves up. And I had created a narrative which said I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't deserving enough to have a good life, right? Because I had a defect or there was something wrong with me, because why would I be in this position unless I had done something? And this is very common for children to intuit and internalize. And I used to think that that dialogue was actually me in truth. And what she taught me was that that dialogue is an artificial construct that has nothing to do with me. You know, we are evolved to protect ourselves. And when things are perfect and good and we're relaxed, oftentimes we're just sitting with that. But what we do look out for is, as an example, if we were on the savannah in Africa and you saw the grass moving a distance away and you knew from experience that probably represented a lion, that will immediately engage your fear response or your sympathetic nervous system. But what happens is that oftentimes the same thing happens with negative commentary and negative events that surround us. And we internalize those, and as a result, we have chronic low-level engagement of our sympathetic nervous system. And you start creating this narrative from words you've heard around you or a sense of things around you that are negative, that it's your fault, you don't deserve things, you're not smart, you're not good. And what happens is, brick by brick, you're building a prison for yourself. And what happens is the prison you're in is small, it starts getting dark, and it becomes impossible to escape. And when she made me realize this, it suddenly struck me that, in fact, that was the case. And she taught me that, in fact, you can change that dialogue. And the changing of that dialogue is what gives you the key to open the prison door and release yourself. And the thing is that until you understand you're in a prison, you can't escape.
Yeah.
It's like a fish in water. He doesn't know he's in water. Right. And it can be dirty water. But if that's all you've ever lived in, you don't know the difference between clean and dirty water because you've never seen clean water, right? Or like being in a prison, if you've never seen the blue sky and the sunshine and the beauty of the world, you think that being in darkness, being in pain, being closed off, being alone is natural and you deserve it. So she allowed me, if you will, to step out of that prison. And that was through self-compassion, which we talked about earlier. Once I was able to see things much more clearly as a result of that, understand that I was in control of the dialogue, once I understood that my potential was within my own hands, reaching my potential, and that oftentimes people hand over their potential to other people. They hand over what they're able to accomplish, who they are, by the dictates of what people they think are telling the truth are saying. And it's very sad. You know, I cannot tell you the number of people who I've run across who said, you know, I remember the specific incident when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. My father said I'd never be anything.
And that voice replays.
Right. And you get more attuned to those negative things, and it reinforces it. And, the reality is, once you say that something is not possible for yourself, by definition, it is not. And so when you can release someone from that self-created prison and they can break out and now see the world with immense, infinite number of possibilities for themselves, it's extraordinary. And the other extraordinary thing is that each of us has this ability and this gift to give to another person, especially a teacher. Mm. Because we know from a variety of studies that how you respond to a student has a huge impact. And we know that when a teacher tells a child they're not smart or implies this, they live up to that expectation. Yeah. It was just like the study that was done in the 50s with the kids who had blue eyes and brown eyes, right? Where you said one was smarter than the other or better than the other, and they immediately took on those roles. Then you come back later and go, oh, I made a mistake, it was the opposite. Did they change again?
Right, and there was another study like that where they told the teacher that these particular kids were gifted. The kids didn't know, but the teachers changed their interaction with these kids based on this fake knowledge. And how it impacted then their scores, right? Whether or not someone believes in us. And I think John Hattie, who's a big education researcher, talks about the belief that a teacher has in a student is one of the most impactful things that there is in the child's learning.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I recall a high school counsel advising me that I didn't have the ability to succeed in college, and it was really a waste of my time, and that I should think of maybe going into a technical thing or a trade school or something like this. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with anything, any profession in which you were passionate about and which you honestly enjoy or like. But the horrible thing is to take people who have great potential to contribute in different spheres and take that option away from them by giving them a false narrative about who they are and what they can accomplish. And you were talking about examples in my book. And I'll share one really quickly, which you're aware of. I barely got into college, and I had a very difficult time. I had no mentors, or my parents had no experience with what college is. And, to sort of be dropped off at a college and you've never understood what studying is or academics or really even what it is to sit at a desk and do your work. Because when you're in an environment like I grew up in, where you have screaming and yelling and sometimes not enough food, you've been evicted. This isn't sort of the ideal study, right, especially if you're in one room, right? You have a TV blaring, some people smoking, it's horrible. And to somehow equate that is equivalent to someone who's grown up in an affluent background with tutors, mentors, access, understanding, knowledge is ridiculous. And, that was my own situation. Here I go off to college, and it was very traumatic. And all my quote unquote friends, fellow students, essentially every one of them was from a professional background, an affluent background. And I was like completely lost, and I did not do well. And unfortunately, as we're talking about negative talk, it was wonderful to have my quote unquote friends tell me I would never go to medical school because my grades weren't good enough, et cetera. And, going to medical school had been a dream of mine since fourth grade when I was a teacher, or I should say a visitor to our class during Professions Day. who was a doctor, and he was just so impressive to me. And again, it came back to the same thing. He talked to me as an equal, showed me respect, and was just completely kind and non-judgmental. Can you hold on for 1 second?
Sure.
Sorry. Hello.
Okay, so we're back.
What I was talking about a little bit earlier was that, so I had no knowledge of what it takes to succeed in college. And as a result, I did not do very well. And at the college I attended, it was a requirement to have an interview with the pre-med committee who would give you a letter of recommendation or not. And so I asked for that appointment, and the secretary really looked at me and she said, "I'm not going to give you an appointment." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it's a waste of everyone's time." And again, how do you tell a young person or any human being that they're a waste of someone's time? It's a horrible, horrible thing to say. And fortunately, because of the confidence that I had developed simply from my interaction with Ruth, I told this woman that that was not acceptable and that I would not leave until she gave me an appointment. And what happened was she indeed gave me an appointment. And that was wonderful, except for the fact that when I showed up for the appointment, there were 3 people in a room with their arms crossed, whose body language told me immediately that they were not happy being there. And in fact, the person in the center who headed this committee took my file, threw it on the table, and said, "Okay, you got your appointment. Let's get this over with, because you're never going to medical school." Now, again, the same type of horrible, horrible thing to tell to a human being. Now, fortunately, though, I was able to not be affected by that and to ask him who gave him the right to destroy people's dreams. And then I proceeded to lecture these 3 people on the reality that there's not a single bit of evidence that beyond above average level of intelligence that you cannot succeed in medical school. There's nothing. This is an arbitrary criteria, so you don't have to do the hard work of actually learning about a human being based on who they really are and making an appropriate decision. It's just simply a screening tool to cut down on the large numbers applying. And I told them that I refused to let them objectify me to a grade point average, and that I demanded that they see my humanity, because they knew nothing about my life, my abilities, my persistence, my beliefs, my integrity, my compassion. And at the end of our one-sided conversation, they were all crying. And they were crying because I forced them to look at my humanity, which no one or very few people can look away from another human being who is authentic and truthful and forces them to look at them in that context. And so ultimately, they gave me the highest level of recommendation. But the other interesting thing was that this secretary, who had been quite dismissive, she had overheard our conversation. And when I left, she handed me a trifold mimeograph brochure. And probably most people listening don't know what a mimeograph piece of paper is, but it's a machine that we had before we had copying machines. And this brochure announced a summer medical education and enrichment program at Tulane University in New Orleans for individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and minorities. And the secretary looked at me and she said, "You know, the deadline has passed for this program, but I don't think that will impact you."
You're not very good at taking no for an answer. So deadlines are, whatever.
So I did call this woman. She did let me in. And really the rest is history. My grade point average when I applied was 2.53. The average grade point average of acceptance was 3.76. And in fact, they also accepted me. I didn't even get a degree, which is, of course, unheard of. Now, the interesting thing about that is that I did, of course, perfectly fine in medical school and was accepted into a highly competitive neurosurgery residency. I'm now a professor at Stanford, and additionally have been a successful entrepreneur, CEO of a medical device company that went public for 1.2 billion. Have given tens and tens of millions of dollars to charity. Am on the board of a large number of nonprofits, and also have remained involved in venture capital and entrepreneurial projects. But to show you, though, how you can never predict what someone is capable of, after Hurricane Katrina, Tulane in New Orleans was flooded. The medical school had to shut down for 2 years and moved to Baylor in Houston. The dean became depressed and resigned. The library was severely damaged. And they were trying to recruit a new dean, and he wanted an endowed chair. And they didn't have the money. So I endowed the dean's chair for several $1,000,000. So the dean is the Doty professor, the dean at Tulane. I rebuilt the library. I set up a multi-million-dollar scholarship in the name of that lady who ran the program that I was in. And I'm the largest donor from the medical school, either faculty or graduate, and I'm on the board of governors and also on the president's council, the Maine University. So it shows you that no one has the right to tell another human being what they are or are not capable of. That can only be decided by that individual. And sadly, though, in some of these narratives, individuals hand that decision over to others and accept what people say or tell them. And my point is that you're the only one who can decide that. And that belief in myself and each of our own potential is amazing, right? Okay, hold on. Maybe you should stop the recording. My door is being knocked on. Yes. You can go ahead.
Okay.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say two things pop into my mind when you say that. There was an old Nike's ad, I don't know, I think it was in the 90s, and it said, they will tell you no 1,000 times no. And it had all this big stuff, but at the end it said, and you will tell them yes. And I think you should be the picture for that Nike ad. I'm going to dig it up and I'm going to send it to you because you are just the epitome of resilience. And so that occurs to me. And then the second thing is just, I think about Ruth, and it actually makes me emotional to think about how Ruth, this woman, had an impact on a 12-year-old boy that has caused this contagion, if you will, to create you, cultivate you, you were created, but to cultivate you, who then cultivates millions. Your book has been translated into, a zillion languages and is, is a bestseller, and you impact people with your work. And it was really back to this one woman, Ruth. And so when I hear teachers or educators say, I don't have time to build relationships, I just have to get the content, like we have to focus on the math or the science or the English. And I feel like the educating of the heart has to come before the educating of the mind or the head. I think Aristotle said that, so I think I'm not alone in that big idea. And so what would you say to educators that are listening about that importance of, you might be that one, you might be Ruth for you in your class?
Well, I think that's true. The problem, of course, though, is that many teachers are suffering and they're overwhelmed and they're not taking care of themselves. So if you're in that mode, it's hard to get to that place where you even have the ability to understand that possibility because you haven't given it to yourself. So I think before we start talking about what we can do to children, we have to be educated for self-care. Once you're able to care for yourself, once you're able to have tools that allow you to see the true nature of reality, to be calm, uh, and to understand truly that within you is this gift that you can freely give. Because it doesn't necessarily mean you have to adopt every child. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend hours and hours with 30 or 40 kids. Sometimes all it takes is a smile, sometimes a simple hug, sometimes a word of encouragement. I had a in my training as a neurosurgeon, I had one particular individual who was our assistant chief, and he contrasted dramatically with our chairman, who would, personally attack you, very insecure, frankly, limited knowledge. And this assistant chairman, he was kind, he was compassionate, he was thoughtful. He understood that, residency was hard. He always had a kind word for you, an encouraging word. And, that person is really the person I look to as my hero, my model, and probably is the reason that I was able to graduate from my residency even. Yet talking to him, that was his natural state. And I came back and told him later how important of an influence he had, but he actually didn't even see that because that's his natural state and what he does every day. Yet, if each of us has this ability to act this way in an open way, in an encouraging way, in an embracing way, you won't even realize the bounty that you can harvest by these kids living up to their potential and becoming just models of what it is to love and to care. And your example sets the atmosphere for what others do, especially children. If they see you being kind, if they see you taking the time, if they see you reaching out, if they see that you truly care, if they see that you're authentic, that's what they will model their own behaviors after. If they see you as short-tempered, insensitive, unkind, bullying, you will see that behavior exhibited. And I don't have to remind you about our present political environment.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to start with the adults. I won't go into the political party, but that would be a whole other hour show. Let me ask you just a couple random questions before we end. If you could go back, if there was a time machine that could go just on one trip, take you there and back, where would you want to go, either in the past or the future, and why?
Well, it's not so much about regrets, but I don't, and we didn't really talk about my parents. My parents were not evil people and they were not unloving people. They just had limited capacity because they did not understand how to deal with their own issues. And so I would be much more empathetic, although ultimately I learned how to be that, but I would probably not want to get away as much as I tried to, right? Because it wasn't a pleasant environment. So I stayed away from that. And perhaps if I took more energy to sort of be present, and it might have changed some things, at least for them. Although at the end of the day, I always felt loved by my parents. In terms of the future, I think the wonderful thing is to be able to look at what impact you've had in terms of your children and to see if your example, your behavior, who you were, impacted them. And also, I think everyone would like to be at their funeral and hear people say nice things about them, right?
Well, hopefully you don't have to wait that long. Hopefully people are already saying nice things about you.
No, I'm very blessed. I'm very blessed.
And then if you were going to the space station for 3 months and you could only bring 3 personal items with you, what would those 3 personal items be?
To be honest with you, I don't need anything
Why?
because the things that have been most important are ones that have allowed you to internally change and to manifest, and you don't need them physically. All you need is your mind. And I know from my own practice that peace, calmness comes from within. It's not anything external. And when you're able to give yourself that gift, you can sit alone and actually be surrounded by everything.
That is a phenomenal answer. Let me ask you one last question, and I ask all my guests this, and you've already kind of said this, but I'm going to just have you hone it in. If you could teach the world just one thing, and granted, the world needs a lot of lessons, but if there was just one thing that would be the biggest takeaway from Dr. James Doty, what would you want them to learn from you?
Well, I'm going to tell you two things.
Okay.
One,
you could cheat because you're a rule breaker, so it's okay. Go
right,
ahead.
right. One is be kind, be kind, be kind, right? The second is each of us has the capacity every day to improve at least one person's life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, yeah, I have no words because I'm a big believer. Thank you so much. I know you're super busy. You have patients calling you and you need to get back to work, but thank you so much for being on the show. I'm going to put links to all your stuff in the comments so people can find you and find the book. And I appreciate your time here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You may want to include in there's a funny thing if you look at BuzzFeed, there's a pop band, a Korean pop band called BTS, and they're a worldwide sensation actually. But they actually read my book. So if you put Google BuzzFeed BTS, my last name, they actually read my book and created a song called Magic Shop in their latest album.
Oh my goodness. I will definitely put that link in the comments. And one other thing, what's next for you? Do you have a new book coming?
I have a new book. It's at least tentatively, it's called Out of the Magic Shop, The Power of Intention.
We'll look forward to that. Well, thanks again for being on the show. I appreciate it. We'll keep in touch. And for the rest of you in the Thrive Tribe, stay tuned. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. See you.